Greetings, one and all. Welcome back to Kinesiology 320 Exercise and Sport Psychology. This is Jock, and I will be your host as we walk through some of the key concepts in Chapter 3, looking at personality and sport. So, first of all, just a general description of what personality is as a blend of characteristics that make people unique. These are at their base, part of your psychological core. And then you have your typical responses as well as role-related behavior. So there's the social environment around you, and at the base of the pyramid are internal factors that constrain you, and at the very top are more external dynamic factors. So these all come into play in terms of how we act in given situations. The psychological core, this connects to the core values that we've been talking about. And these are these things that are really intransigent for us, that are a part of who we are at our most basic self. And so some of those might be your spiritual beliefs, again, your core values that we've been working to identify. Then we layer in typical responses, kind of the temperament we may have more overall. And then there are those things that come up that are more situational and have to do with the role we're playing, whether we're a parent or a child or a student or an adult. All of those things are factors in terms of how we end up behaving and acting. So there are essentially 6 approaches to understanding personality, and they essentially build on each other, starting with the very first one, the psychodynamic, and then trait, situational, interactional, phenomenological, and then the integrated or biopsychosocial approach. So taking these one at a time, psychodynamic might be affiliated with Freud and is sort of that classic perspective that behavior is determined by the unconscious and that we're constantly changing in terms of factors that we come into contact with. And the emphasis is really on going inward and maybe into our past, our childhood, that classic sort of Freudian couch, and identifying traits and experiences from a young age. Secondly, then we're in terms of impact, a couple things. It was an original theory, but not so much a part of today's contemporary sports psychology. It focuses, I think, maybe overly so on internal determinants of behavior, but it doesn't factor in the situation or the social environment. So it was a beginning. The trait approach is another popular one, and we're actually going to look at some of this in terms of the PACE color palette is a trait-based approach, and these are sort of fundamental building blocks to personality, these traits that maybe we're born with and predispose us to behave in certain ways. You see trait-based approaches in a lot of personality profile assessments, but the weakness is it's not always going to help predict the behavior in particular situations. It tends to be small or minimal in terms of its predictive effect. So I think this was important in terms of acknowledging that traits are a part of our personality, but not necessarily all of them, because we also have to factor in interacting, the environment, and of course the situation. So in this case, instead of people being born with certain things or having certain qualities, it's the environment they're in that really shapes them, the situational factors. So let's see, it's widely embraced by most sports psychologists. But again, maybe the situation is not enough. So we've got traits, we've got sort of the internal factors when it comes to that psychodynamic approach, and then we've got the situation. So let's keep building on it. The fourth approach now is combining them, and they're talking about it's both the person and the factor. So it's the internal and the environment, and that's the interactional approach, which has been more widely adopted by sports psychologists. They say there's really not a big weakness. I would say maybe one weakness is considering the next factor, what we're going to call the phenomenological approach. And that now has to do with the mental filter, the way we choose to interpret things, how we end up experiencing the phenomena. So, it's got situational and personal characteristics, but it also takes into account how we interpret. We can see the same thing and have very different understandings. We can hear the word apple, and some of us might think of a fruit, some a computer, some a record company. So that has to do with our past and sort of phenomenological factors. So again, I think this is more nuanced. It's bringing in a more comprehensive and holistic look and looking at the individual and how they interpret things. And I think culture could be factored in, gender, any number of things, identity pieces. So the integrative or the biopsychosocial approach is trying to look at the whole person now. And as I said earlier, it's really building on all of the previous ones. It's a more dynamic, interactive method. This is sort of the meta approach of taking everything, including, self-defined life stories or narratives, all of these really looking at the whole person. So it's a newer approach. It doesn't have as a robust a sort of research base, but it's definitely coming into more broad acceptance. So moving along, I want to introduce this concept of traits and states. So trait is more the typical kind of something that you have more permanently. It more permeates who you are, how you are, just about all of the time. And then the state is something that comes and goes, that's in the moment. So the personality traits can be things that we have that are consistent and sort of a baseline, but then we can also have states where we fluctuate and we end up adapting depending on the environment. So measuring personality, there are a number of different assessments, and it can be difficult to score, and there are a lot of, I think, varying methods. One of the more popular ones is called the Myers-Briggs Personality Indicator, and we've talked about it a little bit, and we're using a variation of that in our colors assessment. It's just a more simplified version. We've talked about that a little bit in class. So do's and don'ts of personality testing. You definitely want to inform people the purpose, exactly how it's going to be used. Make sure that folks who are qualified are administering the test. Integrate personality test results with other information. So don't use it only on its own. And then use sports or exercise specific whenever possible. Other do's, measure state and trait and provide specific feedback based on the results. Compare people against their own baselines rather than against others. Things you don't want to do. Using the test as a big focus on abnormality. Using the test to decide who makes the team and who doesn't. It can be a point of reference, but not a, on or off the team kind of tool. You're going to want to interpret the tests with qualified folks who are familiar and who aren't going to say over-interpret. And you're going to use the test to predict behavior in sports settings without considering other sources. So you don't want to do that. So finishing up here, there is a relationship between personality traits and states and sports performance, but it's far from perfect or concise. And there are some consistent differences that distinguish athletes from non-athletes. However, the differences tend to be small. Personality alone doesn't account for behaviors in sport and exercise. No single definitive personality profile has been found to be sort of better or worse for sport. It could be more situational. And then just last couple slides. There are a few differences between men and women around personality, especially at the elite level. Morgan's 1980 mental health model shows that successful athletes exhibit greater positive mental health than do less successful. So there's a virtuous cycle with success and mental health in terms of athleticism. And then extroversion and conscientiousness are positively related to physical activity involvement, while neuroticism is negatively related. So yeah, physical activity helps increase people's conscientiousness and extroversion and helps reduce neuroticism. So lastly, you want to, as far as using and understanding personality, consider the traits and situations, be informed, sort of have a more holistic approach, communicate well, be a good observer, and be knowledgeable about mental strategies. So lastly, are we born or do we learn our personalities? And it seems like it's about 50-50. We get some of it just from how we come into the world, and then other factors, the other half we acquire based on environment, situation, and experience. All right, thanks everybody.